Texans have been struggling in the wake of severe winter storms and widespread power failures. Already, the questions over the complex and technical causes of the crisis have become politicized. Some politicians and pundits are crying climate change, and they're seizing on the crisis in Texas to call for more green energy as a solution. Now, to reach a full objective analysis of the power failures in Texas, it's something that requires investigation and specialized expert knowledge. That's not our aim today. Instead, our goal is to look at the vital philosophic ideas that are shaping the policy debate now underway. And to do that, we'll be drawing on Ayn Rand's profound analysis of the environmental movement. Welcome to the New Ideal podcast. I'm Elan Journo, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Keith Lockitch.
Hello.
Hey, Keith. Now, for those of you watching the live stream, it's great to have you with us. We'll aim to take some questions posted to YouTube Super Chat if you'd like to post them there. Now, Keith, I want to get started by sharing something that I found really striking. One thing I observed when we were talking about this earlier is that the debate really got politicized almost instantaneously. And it was one thing that I noticed is people were treating the problem or the sort of the causes of the problem, the crisis, as obvious and sort of rushing to their favorite solution. And I want to just share this quote from Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. I think this is from a tweet. I read it in the newspaper. I'm not sure what the source of it was. And so here's what she said. And I think this is sort of typical of the attitude that's come up in the debate. Quote, "The infrastructure failures in Texas are quite literally what happens when you don't pursue a Green New Deal." That's the quote she has to say. So I would just throw that to you, Keith, and tell me, what do you think of that? How do you process it?
Yeah, I observed the same thing. And I mean, this is part of the reason why I think we're deliberately taking the position that we're not here to adjudicate what happened in Texas, because we don't, I think there's something important about the state of our culture and the lack of respect for expert knowledge. I don't know how the electricity market works in Texas. There's so many factors that went in here, but what you see is people immediately rushing to the stage to pontificate on what did happen, even though, the causes are quite complicated. And then you have people like AOC immediately jumping to this as proof that her policy agenda is the one that we need to adopt. Now, so it's true that the causes of the Texas crisis are complicated, and we're not going to spend a lot of time. I want to say just one thing about it, which is that it's true that the causes of what happened are complicated, and there's a lot of information you can find out about what went on. But the idea that the solution to a crisis like this is anything like the Green New Deal or the Biden climate energy plan is pretty clearly wrong. I mean, the one thing we can say about Texas, what you had was a failure of the electricity grid to respond reliably to a spike in demand. And what you need to have a reliable, resilient electricity supply is generating capacity that can respond to fluctuations in demand for electricity, right? Now wind and solar are not forms of electricity that respond to demands for electricity. They're not forms of electricity that you can turn on and off at will. They respond to the wind blowing and the sun shining. So they're fluctuating sources of electricity that have almost nothing to do with actual demand on the grid. So, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the media, the New York Times is pushing the view that Texas is somehow proof that we need to double down on the Biden climate and energy policy agenda. But there's literally no alternate reality in which having more solar and wind, would have been the solution, would have done anything to prevent what happened in Texas. In fact, it's definitely the case that it would have made the situation far worse than it even was. So, what I think we should pull from this is there's a huge disconnect between, the claims about what we need to be doing to ensure stable, reliable energy for the future, and the views on these issues that dominate the culture. AOC is not some kind of outlier, right? The view that she expressed is kind of the dominant mainstream view. And it's completely disconnected from reality.
So let's dig into that. How do you think of this disconnect? Because it's significant. It's not just a small thing, right?
Yeah, and as you said in the open, I mean, it's connected with the rise of the environmentalist movement over the last half century or so, and that's really, I think, what we wanted to talk about today. 50 years ago, Ayn Rand published her book, The New Left: The Anti-Industrial Revolution, and one of the essays in that book was a talk that she gave in 1970 called The Anti-Industrial Revolution, and this was her analysis of the kind of then nascent environmentalist movement. And I think the reason we wanted to do this podcast today and to focus on this is it's worth looking really closely at that talk and at that essay, because Rand was really ahead of her time in identifying the essential nature of the environmentalist movement and what it would lead to if its goals were to be adopted. So in the late 60s, she was observing the rise of what was then referred to as kind of the ecology movement, right? And at the time, it was viewed as a kind of a fringe movement. And it was an element of what was also talked about at the time, the so-called New Left. So again, in the 60s, you had a lot of commentators talking about the rise of the New Left, in contrast to the Old Left, which was associated with the kind of older generation of hardcore Marxist intellectuals and apologists for Soviet communism that you saw, more in the early part of the 20th century. And so she's situating her analysis of environmentalism within the bigger context of the shift from the Old Left to the New Left, and her analysis of, why that shift occurred and what gave rise to it is really, it's one of the things that she goes into in the book, in various essays in the book, and it's really illuminating, and it gives, I think, deep insight into why environmentalism is one of the perspectives that the New Left adopted. So we could talk about that now, I think.
Yeah, I think it's useful just to add some context for people listening and watching, that what was discussed at the time, what was the New Left, how did it contrast with old-line Marxists? And I think one of the main points of difference, as Ayn Rand analyzed the difference between them, so the New Left was a term that was current at the time. It wasn't her particular term. But I think one of the main points of difference is that if you look at Marxist writings over decades and decades, their view was that industrialization, industrial society, and technology were things that belonged in society and they were important. It was just that capitalism wasn't the system to keep them going, but the socialist system, on this theory, was going to do better at industrialization and better at advancing technology. And so the thrust of it was that Marxism positioned itself, and its thinkers positioned themselves as in favor of progress and advancement of human society. And now this was it's a myth. It's completely false. It's not borne out by facts or history. And yet this is the way Marxism was seen. It was scientific socialism, right? So it was really couching itself in that kind of language. What the New Left comes along and does in Ayn Rand's analysis is drop the focus on progress, on industrialization, on science, and really fundamentally, if you think of it, what's philosophically going on here, it's dropping the pretense of having reason on its side. And so this is a big change, so a real cleavage in that intellectual moral movement. And I think that's that goes to the core of her view of what the ecology movement is. And so in a sense, if you have socialist thinking minus this stress on progress, minus industrialization, and not just sort of downplaying it, but in fact turning against it. So the idea is that originally Marxists complained that capitalism, it was creating too much, right? Now, so this is part of the new critique, is that, yeah, this is a problem. We have too many things. We shouldn't be doing this. And this is, I think, goes to the ecology movement is an outgrowth of this New Left perspective. Like, who cares about progress?
Yeah, so the old line Marxist point of view was that capitalism is inefficient, it can't produce, and that, you know, you had leaders, you know, you had the Soviet leaders in the early part of the 20th century saying we will bury the West. You know, we're going to outproduce the West. We're going to out-industrialize. We're going to, you know, we're going to take over the world with industrial progress. And of course, I mean, from Rand's perspective, this is all nonsense, because what makes progress possible, what makes you know, science, technology, industry, you know, economic progress possible is the freedom of the individual mind, and the idea that that statist, collectivist central planning is able to do this, you know, and the idea that so it was a you know, sort of a big lie to begin with. And Rand's perspective is that it's in the aftermath of World War II, and, you know, through the 1960s, where you can take, you have almost these scientific experiments. You take West Berlin and East Berlin, you know, and West Germany and East Germany. You divide it in half. One is sort of relatively free markets and relatively capitalistic, and the other one is dominated by Soviet-style communism. You just put them side by side, and you see human progress and flourishing and well-being on the West side, and total stagnation, poverty, tyranny, dictatorship on the other side. So her view is that by the time you get to the 1960s, it's too obvious to ignore or evade the reality that collectivism can't produce. And so she says, in effect, the leftist intellectuals were faced with a choice. Do you continue to embrace the goal of industrial and technological progress and recognize that statism, collectivism, altruism doesn't produce that, and what you need to embrace is capitalism, or not? And she says, in effect, the new left and the environmentalist movement as an outgrowth of that is the leftist intellectuals rejecting the goal of industrialization and human progress. I just want to read a quote, because I think this captures this element of review. She says, quote, if concern with poverty and human suffering were the collectivist motive, they would have become champions of capitalism long ago. They would have discovered that it's the only political system capable of producing abundance, but they evaded the evidence as long as they could. When the issue became overwhelmingly clear to the world, the collectivists were faced with a choice: either turn to the right in the name of humanity, or to the left in the name of dictatorial power. And she says they turned to the left, the new left. Instead of their old promises that collectivism would create universal abundance and their denunciations of capitalism for creating poverty, they're now denouncing capitalism for creating abundance. You know, instead of promising comfort and security for everyone, they're now denouncing people for being comfortable and secure. And I think this brings us back to the question about what really are the goals of the environmentalist movement, because, you know, the general perception that people have about environmentalism is that its goal is to preserve the environment for the sake of advancing human flourishing and human well-being. And I think Ayn Rand was one of the first people to really question that dogma and to look closely at what the stated goals and the ideals of the environmentalist movement are, and what they would really look like if they were actually put into practice. And that you know, what she identified is that their goal is not to preserve the environment for the sake of human well-being. It's to preserve sort of wild nature from human imposition and from human interference. And so what it's really trying to do is to stop us from interfering with nature and you know, from in effect from producing and from industrializing and developing and creating a human world.
I think we should say more about that. I just want to make a point here in connection to the way people think of these issues today versus how she was seeing the rise of a new phenomenon, a new movement intellectually. And I think there's a major difference, and it speaks to the spread and mainstreaming of environmentalism. As you mentioned, it was it was a fringe phenomenon initially, and she was early in noticing it and anticipating its significance. So I think the way people think of environmentalism isn't as an ism anymore. It's that it's just the common sense view. It's what it means to be scientific. It's obvious in many ways that, of course, nobody wants to harm the planet. Nobody wants to pollute the water and pollute the air. And we all want clean air, clean water, and so forth. And the assimilation of environmentalist ideas, so this movement's assimilation into the mainstream and becoming the default position for people, it's just the sensible pro-science perspective, as many people think of it, speaks to, I think, both how she was perceptive, Ayn Rand was perceptive about the way this movement was going to move forward. But I think it doesn't change the fact that it is an ism. It's a set of ideas fundamentally. And I think part of her analysis, which I think we'll get into as we go into her view of what it means for environmentalist ideas to succeed, part of her analysis is that environmentalism is not primarily a claim about scientific facts and dangers and risks that we face. It's not primarily concerned with those things. It's a certain perspective. It's an ideological movement. It's primarily driven by ideas about what society should look like. And the science comes in, and it's co-opted and it's perverted in various ways. And there's real issues that are mixed in there. Like there's things like smog, and then we can talk about, but those aren't the driving force of what this movement is about. And that goes to your point, Keith, that you said that she was really incisive in recognizing that it's a mistake to see the ecology movement as it was at the beginning, or environmentalism as it was in the last decades, or the way those ideas have become mainstream today, as primarily concerned with human well-being, both in its genesis and in the logic of its position. I think it's a devastating critique when you take it seriously. And I think we should talk more about what it looks like in practice. But I think it's important to contrast the way the ism has kind of fallen off and become a conventional view, in effect.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's set that up by looking at some of the evidence. This is some of the evidence that she refers to, and some of the evidence that we can look back, with 50 years of looking at what the environmentalist movement has advocated and what has come to pass. So, one of the things that she notes is you talked about the idea that there's a claim to science, which is really not legitimate, or it's a phony claim to science. So there's a pattern of making apocalyptic predictions, and in the 60s you had Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb, predicting this population explosion. And it's the idea that and this is an idea that goes back centuries, of course, back to Malthus and beyond, the idea that population growth is going to outstrip food production to a point where people are literally starving. And he made predictions of, hundreds of millions of people dropping dead from starvation around the globe. And this is right at the time when the world was on the eve of the so-called green revolution, not green as in environmentalism, but green as in agriculture. You had Norman Borlaug, the pioneer of this green revolution, developing all these new strains of wheat and this sort of thing. And so instead of this mass death as a result of humans over consuming and draining all the Earth's resources, instead what you have is such a massive increase in food production. If you look at it rendered all these apocalyptic claims just to be nonsense. And this is a pattern that you see over and over again. There's all kinds of claims about the catastrophic effects that will result from human beings, having too great an impact on the earth, right? But if you look at the data, I mean, there's a whole literature now of books, and there's this great website, Our World in Data. But you have a whole bunch of people like Steven Pinker in his book Enlightenment Now. You have, Matt Ridley. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who point to, by every measure of human well-being, what we've seen since the Industrial Revolution is completely steady and unwavering progress in life expectancy, in food production, in levels of poverty. It's just every measure of human well-being has shown unwavering improvement, in contrast to these apocalyptic claims that the environmentalist movement continues to issue. And so this is a big part of the evidence that that you can use to recognize. So actually, we got a super chat question that says, "Do you think environmentalism is similar to a religion?" So thank you for the super chat donation. But I think this is exactly where I'm going with the point that I'm making. Is these environmental ideals and ideas are held in total defiance of all the actual evidence that we have about measures of human well-being, and every single apocalyptic claim is they make a prediction 10 years out, 10 years later nothing happens, and so again and again what you see is what's driving this is a certain set of philosophical and ideological premises, not primarily a focus on facts and science and that sort of thing.
I think just to build on what you said regarding this parallel with religion, I think there's more to say in this vein. If you think about if you sort of transpose some of what we hear, if you accept that it's not primarily about the science, and you then transpose some of the claims you hear, the apocalyptic warnings that don't come true. I mean, that's definitely a mark of early religions were expecting the world to end. I think Christianity is one of those mystery cults that became a worldwide phenomenon. It started with the premise that, well, we're about to see the end of days. Obviously, that didn't happen. But this whole idea that there's an apocalypse coming, and I think if you tie it into the moral thinking of religion and the idea that there is a sin for which we have to atone, and there's a sacrifice that's required of us, that definitely maps on to what we hear today. And in the way in which I think many people hold environmentalist ideas, they probably don't recognize that they're holding them, and that these are these ideas they should contest and challenge, but yet the way we're expected to take certain measures to alleviate problems, which are not obviously problems, are not established as problems in many cases, and that the remedies themselves don't really do anything. I think a good example of this is I've read that a lot of the recycling that is collected and sorted is just not economically viable to then recycle some of this material. So it just gets shipped somewhere and falls into landfills because it's not economically worthwhile. And I don't think it does very much good in that. And so you have this whole pattern of there's a sin, or our whole engagement with nature, where we're corrupting of nature. So therefore we have to atone for that sin by all sorts of sacrifices, doing less, driving less, using fewer materials, and this whole perspective that there is now some higher end above human life to which we have to sacrifice. And so I think this gives the lie to the idea that it's concerned with human well-being. It is not. I think it's a system that is calculated to orient you towards the sacrifice of values for no real sacrifice. So the surrender of a higher value to a lesser value. I think that speaks to, so there's many dimensions in which there are strong similarities between what is environmentalism and religion. And I think it's worth having a conversation about that at some time. But thank you for the super chat donations. Again, those of you who want to ask questions, you're welcome to submit them through that channel.
Yeah,
Keith, there's more we wanted to cover. Why don't we, do you want to, sorry.
Well, just to pick up on what you were just saying, and we got a question over Zoom, which I think is relevant to the next point that I wanted to make, which is, so the question is, what if we extrapolate from Ayn Rand's beautiful philosophy developed when we had not reached the limits of our globe, and then ask what would be the solution to climate change and the rough time estimates we now face? Without an environmentalist movement, what would we do? So this is exactly, so climate, the climate issue is exactly in line with the pattern that I'm describing. So first of all, there's no question that man-made carbon emissions are contributing to changes in the climate. So let's just push that that issue off the table to begin with. So that's unquestionably true, etc. The thing that people push back on when you talk about climate change is the question of whether it feeds in exactly with this question of these apocalyptic claims. So what people challenge, people who challenge the climate change narrative, it's not that they challenge the idea that climate change is a real phenomenon. It's the question of whether what we face is an unmanageable catastrophe, an apocalyptic catastrophe that requires the kinds of measures that people are advocating, which really amounts to almost a total reduction in our emissions of carbon dioxide. Now, so the idea that we've reached the limits of our globe, for instance, or that, the question asked about rough time estimates we now face. So the problem is that the claim that we reach the limits of our globe, the claim that we face time estimates of the kind, you have people like Greta Thunberg and AOC saying that, unless we adopt radical climate policy choices immediately, the world's going to end by 2030. So this is exactly the kind of apocalyptic claim that I think Ayn Rand would have rejected and that we're rejecting. It's if you look at every measure of human well-being, including things like agricultural production, when you talk about reaching the limits of our globe, we're nowhere near reaching the limits of what the human mind is capable of if we leave it free to invent and create and produce. So if what you're worried about is the risks of climate catastrophes and extreme weather events and that sort of thing, then what you should be advocating for is absolute laissez-faire capitalism, free people's minds to innovate and produce and create, and leave us free to build the kind of resilience and industrial development that actually makes human progress and human well-being possible. So it's
one quick thought on that, Keith, just if I can jump in. So for people who are concerned about some of the claims that we're going to run out of either space or resources, I think this is something that's been studied, and I think it's worth investigating so that you don't just take what we're saying for granted. To go find out, is this really true? What would happen if there's an important resource that we just run out of? It's conceivable that would happen. Now, what would happen? And as you really stressed, I think this is an important factor. If people are left free, if there's an important resource that we need for manufacturing technology, maybe we need it for circuit boards, or maybe we need it for cars or something like that. Think of a resource that you think is going to become scarcer. What would happen if people are left free to solve that problem? And I think the pattern across history, as I've from the reading that I've done, is people find alternatives. They find solutions to it, and often they find it way before you reach the final ounce of whatever it is that you're trying to worry about that is becoming scarce. And the reason for that is the one thing that it gets dropped out of the context of a lot of these apocalyptic accounts is, well, what would people do if they faced a real problem with one of these situations? Like if you take, like, smog is a real problem, right? Now, there's ways you can mitigate it, and there's ways you can tackle it, but you don't wait until we're all choking and collapsing on the sidewalks before you tackle it. And I think the X factor that's missing from a lot of these apocalyptic stories just is the human mind and its capacity to solve problems and move human life forward. And this whole idea of the engine of progress, and this is Ayn Rand's fundamental insight that she really illuminated, is that the human mind has a central role in the creation of human values and in moving society forward. It's the power behind technology and science. So whenever there are scarcities of resources, where you think that we're going to have some sort of cataclysmic problem, the thing to do is to leave people free to solve whatever is a legitimate actual problem. And I think you see this with, so you mentioned Malthus, I think earlier, about this worry about we won't have enough things for people to eat as the population grows. And he has these charts and graphs to show this is what it looks like. And we're heading in this. Well, what happened is people came up with ways to make land more fertile, and they found ways to make agriculture more efficient. And so, not to say that everything Malthus worried about was a real problem, but if you worry about something like that, if you think there's a concern, if there is a real concern, it's the way to tackle it is to leave people free to solve it. And that's exactly what you would want anyone who's concerned with human life to be at the barricades for. Okay, this is what you would need to fight for. And yet that's exactly the opposite of what you hear from people who are championing environmentalist solutions. It's not, let's have the best idea in a free market by the best minds come to some sort of resolution. It's, we're going to tell you how to solve this, and it's going to require a fundamental and possibly cataclysmic sacrifice on your part. It's going to change your life from top to bottom. You're not going to be able to drive the car you want. You won't be able to live where you want. It's a fundamental downgrading of human life, as you know, from top down. I think that is a telling signal.
Yeah, I think, and the whole issue of green energy, and then just the energy policy, I think is a really perfect example of that. Because if you look at, like, I think one of the lessons you can definitely take from what happened in Texas is just how crucial energy plays in our lives. And one of the problems is that people take technology for granted. You know, they take it for granted. This stuff is all around us. We don't know how it got here. We don't pay much attention to what's required to produce it and create it. We just, you know, we have our phones, we have our computers, we have our cars, we have this incredible standard of living all around us, and most of us have no idea what is required to make all of that happen. And this is certainly true for energy as well. You know, when we go to flick the light switch, the lights come on. And if we go to turn the heat up, the heat turns on. We don't give much thought to what it takes for that to happen, until you have a crisis like Texas, and then everyone's, you know, it suddenly becomes an urgent issue. But the thing is that the environmentalist movement has consistently opposed every actually viable form of energy from its inception. I mean, the first huge campaign was the anti-nuclear movement, and the incredible campaigning against nuclear energy has created such a huge morass of regulatory structures, you know, that this is partly why nuclear is so prohibitively expensive, and you have all these concerns about the cost of nuclear. Most of that is purely a result of, you know, kind of regulatory structures that add to the costs. And now you have this huge push against, you know, all forms of fossil fuel energy. The reality is that more than, you know, if you take fossil fuel plus nuclear, I mean, that's basically where all of our energy comes from. You know, the idea that you can power our civilization with wind and solar, you know, which today are a pretty small fraction of our energy supply. And as we talked about right at the beginning of the podcast, they don't represent sort of reliable, stable base load energy supply. They add this, you know, unstable, fluctuating component to grid that has to be offset by even more fossil fuel backup capacity. So, you know, the fact that the environmentalist movement has been consistently opposed to all the forms of energy that we actually need to keep our civilization going, I think is strong evidence of what the real goal is, and what the and the kinds of sacrifices that will be demanded of us if those goals are actually achieved.
Yeah, I think it's significant that we often hear crises used in this way. So we started with the situation in Texas, which is really severe. I mean, it's one of the richest, most energy-rich states in general, and it you can see why people are trying to make sense of it. But whenever there's a hurricane or whenever there is some damage caused by flooding, each of these is taken as obvious further evidence that we're heading down this road to calamity. And you've talked about this in other contexts about the science behind the concerns regarding hurricanes and the severe weather. And I think there's real scientific questions to understand there. But part of what happens in this debate, I think, is that it gets colored immediately by the moral goals, the goals driven by moral ideas here, that anything is taken as, well, this is just more support for what we already know has to happen, as opposed to, well, what's actually going on? I think the underlying driving force is this idea: civilization as we know it needs to change, and it needs to go backwards in time. And there are people on the environmentalist side who will deny this. They'll say, no, of course it's not what we want. We really want just clean air and everyone to live happily. But I think the logic of their position, as we've been trying to argue and give some evidence for, is that it devalues what is fundamental about the world we live in, which is it's a post-industrial civilization. We're the beneficiaries, and we take for granted, as you pointed out earlier, Keith, we take for granted the immense achievement that was created thanks to the scientific revolution and then the industrial revolution, which are things that just aren't well known or understood. And the focus of a lot of people is their day-to-day and the kind of technology that they take for granted. There isn't an appreciation that, but for the Industrial Revolution, none of us would be here, let alone watching something on the internet with technology that is just, it is mind-bogglingly advanced and impressive and admirable. But it just, the prevalence of electricity, that more people around the world have access to electricity than ever in human history. All of this is the fruit of an industrial society, and it's something to celebrate. It's not something to find and undermine, which I think the undermining of the industrial civilization is to me the moral crime involved here that we see from people pushing environmentalist ideas. And I think this goes to, I want to circle back to the book that you mentioned earlier, Ayn Rand's book, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. I think that really goes to the heart of her analysis, which is, I mean, we should sort of unpack that a bit, but it just, she has a profoundly positive appreciation for what made the Industrial Revolution possible and what its myriad manifestations in our lives look like and how we take it for granted. And then what it looks like if you go against that and you kind of take an anti-industrial perspective. And I think this is one of the most powerful things in that essay right at the beginning, when she starts to say, well, let's dramatize what this really looks like. And what does our world look like when we don't have all these things?
Yeah, and one of them would be like if environmentalist aims were actually put into practice, and it's sort of this grim picture of a guy, who all the so-called luxuries of technology are gone and so on, but one of the points that she makes is that part of the reason people don't reckon the actual goals is precisely because they take technology for granted, and they don't, and they even though they don't connect all the dots to see that what it would actually look like if the goals were put into practice. So again, I think coming back to the issue of energy, I think so. I have an essay on the environmentalist position on energy from a few years ago that I think makes an attempt to really connect all these dots. And I think I talked a little bit about how you have environmental groups opposed to every major form of fossil fuel energy, also nuclear. You also see opposition to hydro. But I think the thing that really clinches it for me is when you see environmentalist opposition to solar and wind. You have solar and wind projects that are planned for certain areas, and you have environmental groups leading the charge saying, oh, you're not going to go develop, create a huge solar development in the desert or something like that. That's interfering with nature. So I think that these are the kinds of pieces of evidence that you need to put together to see what are the actual goals here, and where is all this, where would all this actually lead if it were put into practice? And I mean, just coming back to what we said at the beginning, the idea that people could be advocating more wind and solar, that what we saw in Texas is proof that we need more windmills, so that they can also not generate electricity when the wind dies down during this incident. It gives rise to the need to look more deeply at the ideas underlying the movement to make sense of what's going on. So I'm not hearing your microphone now.
Oh, sorry. Keith, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that would be something that would be good to recommend for people to take if they want to explore Ayn Rand's perspective, which I think is really challenging compared to the conventional views out there. And it's sophisticated and nuanced. So she takes seriously the sort of the context of people who are hearing about the initial claims made in the name of the ecology movement, as it was called at the time. And I think her analysis is really insightful. And it a lot of people talk about this or that prediction didn't age well. I think the takeaway from reading the Anti-Industrial Revolution is that not only did she get a lot right, I think she got the fundamental right, that this has just become more and more validated. I mean, her analysis is more validated by the experience of the last 50 years since she put this, she brought this out. So I would recommend that people take a look at that. I think you mentioned another essay regarding her analysis of the old versus the new left. I think people can take a look at that on our website. I think that's published on aynrand.org. And you can find excerpts in the lexicon, Ayn Rand lexicon. Yeah, the left, old, and new.
Yeah, go ahead.
And so I think with that, why don't we wrap it up and just sort of final thoughts about what, any concluding observations?
Well, there's a lot in her essay that we didn't really cover. We just sort of touched on some of the points that she makes there, but it's definitely worth. It's definitely worth. You can hear the talk version of the Anti-Industrial Revolution on our website, and you can obviously read it in the book, The New Left: The Anti-Industrial Revolution. It's worth looking at how she really lays out and unpacks her analysis of the environmentalist movement, because there's so much that's so prescient, and when you read it and you think this was 50 years ago, it's amazing to see how clear-eyed she was about what was coming with this movement. So and I think we have some links to some of my articles on these subjects as well. So
yeah, and you should we have Keith's article on our online here, The Green New Deal: A War Against Energy. I highly recommend you take a look at that. You can find a lot of these resources on our journal, New Ideal. Now, a final thought I just want to share before we wrap up for today is, I think one of the points that comes out from looking at Ayn Rand's analysis from 50 years ago and then thinking about what has happened in society since then. I made the point earlier, and I think it really bears emphasis, that the environmentalist movement has gone mainstream, and the fact that it has is really interesting. And I think it's a further illustration of a different point that Ayn Rand has made, which is that to understand culture and society and the direction it takes, it's important to see the fundamental ideas that are shaping it. I think in this case, it's certain ideas about morality that underlie the environmentalist conception of what they're doing that are really essential to understanding how we got to the point where it's not an ism in many people's minds, it's just the normal way to look at the world. And I think it's a really sad outcome where we are. And I think it was another perspective on her view is that unless this sort of thing is opposed by rational ideas, by a rational perspective, by people looking at the world objectively and taking a moral framework that is human life centered, and that's, I think, essential to her perspective. Unless that's done, these sort of evil ideas, and I think they are evil and they lead to heinous outcomes, this is what would happen unless you really oppose them. So I think there's a lot to be gained from sort of understanding how this phenomenon has become such a established part of our culture. So, and if people are interested in that, we have a conference coming up that will talk about Ayn Rand's analysis of how ideas shape a society, and how people who speak about and write about ideas, intellectuals, are central to the direction of a culture. So that's coming up in March. If you're interested, there's a lot to be said and explored in that direction. So finally, I would encourage everyone who's listening to us on YouTube, if you are there, we'd love for you to subscribe so you hear more about what we do. And if you like what you're hearing, like the video and share it, and give us your comments. We always read the comments. We don't always reply, but we take them into heart. And sometimes they lead to other programming. If you're on Facebook or other social media, please like and share what you're viewing. That helps us get to a larger audience. We appreciate your support. And finally, if you have feedback about this or other of our programs, we'd love to hear from you. You can write to us, newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything. We try to answer as much as we can. And we'd like to hear your suggestions or comments and feedback. So we hope to see you here next time. Thanks for watching.